How do you interpret the one China policy? To my understanding, the United States should only have one China policy, which is based on the three communique and Taiwan Relation Act. And previous President Ma In-jo, I think he pretty much relies on the three communique. He locked Taiwan into the one China principle. Okay, so that means that Taiwan gets no way, has to be under the one China, under the Beijing. President Tsai is a little bit different. She insists in the state of quo, and state of quo means that the should be pretty much way on the Taiwan Relation Act. Okay, so in that understanding, how do you interpret the you personally? How do you interpret that? Is that three part of the one China policy? There's only one China in the world, which is PRC represent the whole China today. But very important one, Taiwan is not part of China. Okay, that's my understanding of one China policy. Only one question to you: how do you evaluate the deployment of the THAD defense system in Taiwan?
Okay, so I think there are actually a couple of questions in there, and one is you're right to highlight that there is when China talks about one China principle and the U.S. talks about a one China policy, those are not exactly the same thing. For the U.S., I think the one China policy is a pragmatic way of dealing with the reality of the situation in the cross-strait relationship and our relationships with the PRC, and unofficial but extremely important relationship with Taiwan. And I think that within whatever you kind of imagine are the confines of that, there's still a lot of room for flexibility and for upgrading different aspects of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. So without getting out of that framework, I think some of the legislation that that calls for higher level exchanges between the U.S. and Taiwan, those are all things that you can do without departing from the overall framework. So again, I think there's a certain amount of flexibility within it that we can be creative and try to find solutions to problems there. As for that, for Taiwan, I really don't know enough about the technical details to evaluate it from sort of a military standpoint in terms of how much it would contribute to Taiwan's overall addressing the air and missile defense problem. Obviously, that's one consideration, and the other consideration is sort of the budget one, and then the third is the political considerations. I think you'd have to evaluate it in all of those categories. Again, sometimes I worry about whether we would do something that leaves Taiwan worse off because of China's response, and that could very well be in that category potentially. I mean, and I view President Tsai as having a pretty pragmatic approach, but being in sort of a difficult position vis-a-vis the party leadership in Beijing, and given how that has worked out for the China South Korea relationship, I'm not, you'd have to take that into account clearly. There are also a lot of arguments among defense specialists in the U.S. about, leaving aside the Korea scenario, which is the different one in terms of number and types of North Korean missiles and so on, but how much to invest in active missile defense versus hardening and dispersal and camouflage and concealment and other things, and you'd have to do a fair amount of operations research or modeling and simulation to, I think, get answers about those kinds of questions. It's beyond the level of knowledge that I have to bring to the table today, unfortunately.
Any questions? I really agree with you that Taiwan has a lot to learn from U.S. and receive a lot of help from U.S. in terms of strategy and equipment and even technology help. But I want to point out one surprise to me that seems like it's not really helping that well in terms of air defense. What I observe is from the last year's NAN report regarding the replacing the Air Force with air defense system missiles, basically. But their simulation put the major equipment of U.S. supplied what's that, Patriot system, and its attrition rate is 50% to 75%. And the main reason for that is it's suggesting a shoot and run strategy, but the time it takes it to run after shooting is 30 minutes, and render it kind of a disposable radar. And what I'm surprised is that actually 7 years ago, 10 years ago, the Russian system already achieved a 5-minute hit and run. And basically what they tell me is American system is not built for that kind of strategy that Taiwan needed. And without knowing Taiwan's need and just push the kind of equipment to Taiwan, and Taiwan seems like not knowing what they need and just take it. And I think in terms of arms sale, maybe there's a mismatch there. I don't know, after so many years, is that still not being taken account? And the kind of Rand report, the most prestigious report, still do that kind of suggestion. I'm surprised.
So I think there are kind of two major parts to the question, right? One is the threat that Chinese air and missile forces pose to Taiwan has changed a lot over the years. So if you go back to when we were first talking about, Patriot air defense systems, I mean, the threat is way bigger and more sophisticated than it used to be. So there's a much harder problem. So that's just one element. Is that, if you take a look at, say, the annual Department of Defense reports on Chinese military power, they at least provide a range, if not an exact number, of different kinds of Chinese missile systems most of the years that those are published. So if you go back and look at the ones from, say, the first few years that was published in the early 2000s, and then look at them now, and you see there's like a 5- or 6-fold increase in the number of missiles that can range Taiwan just for the rocket force, just ballistic missiles. I'm not even counting the cruise missiles. And not counting the Air Force. So when you add all of that in, it gets even worse. So now the Rand report, I went to Taiwan not long after it came out. I was not one of the authors of the report, so I was sort of in the position of kind of defending it, but really just trying to have a discussion about it. And part of what I told people was, it's kind of an OR type report, right? I mean, it's focused on tactical level, sort of operations research. And there are broader political considerations that it didn't address, right? And one of those is, what kind of air force does Taiwan want to have, not just in, sort of a high-end conflict scenario, but what kind of air force does Taiwan's air force want to be for, its own institutional reasons? What does the defense establishment in Taiwan think is the, for both external audience and for internal political reasons, kind of the right way to modernize their air force? It was that all those broader political questions are not part of that kind of analysis. So I felt like some of the objections to the report, while potentially quite valid, were sort of beyond the scope of the report. So there was a little bit of, the report is about one thing, and some of the objections to it are, you could object that maybe those are things that should be included in that kind of analysis, but generally speaking, they're not. So there was kind of a disjuncture there for sure. I think it's good research and was well done for the questions it was supposed to address, but you could certainly argue about whether it addresses all of the questions that are really the important ones for Taiwan. Sometimes on the U.S. side, I think people want to say, well, a particular arms sale is largely symbolic. We shouldn't be doing that. But sometimes the symbolism matters. And, there's no good way to factor into a, sort of modeling and simulation run on a, missile attack against an airfield, the political symbolism of arms sales to Taiwan, or the deterrence value that political symbolism might have, right? So they're just kind of two different types of analysis. So I'm sympathetic to the argument. I don't really know how to fully resolve it, because I think there's, you could tell me that F-35s would help Taiwan, a certain amount in terms of the, air and missile attack modeling and simulation, and how they would be able to respond to kind of contest what China's doing with its air force. And that might suggest that you should or should not pursue them as a, cost-effective means of addressing that problem. but then there is that larger political and diplomatic context, and there isn't really, any way to model that in a meaningful way as much as people might like to. So those are just, related but sort of distinct questions in a sense.
Okay. I'm going to go Carl, and then we'll come to you.
So, Michael, to maybe continue that discussion on deterrence, that the Taiwan defense problem is the problem from hell. And so you can look at their planners thinking about deterrence in 3 different ways, and you just came on to the first way, and that is U.S. deterrence. How do you get the U.S. credibly to commit quickly to the fight? And that leads you then to think about arms purchases from the United States. Maybe that's a way to signal the Chinese in the mainland that the United States is really with us. It might have to do with making sure you're more interoperable with U.S. forces, because if they come in, you're going to be fighting together with them. Maybe having talks to figure out what bases the U.S. might use if it actually came into Taiwan. So that's one. The second kind of deterrence would be Taiwan's own military deterrence. Buy the right kinds of systems, develop the doctrine that you need to make the PLA, even in this year of 2017, when they're much, much stronger on a relative basis against Taiwan than they were 20 years ago, but still keep thinking about that and make this so punishing for the PLA, they don't want to do it, at least for the next 5 or 10 years. And then there's a third way, and that's more political deterrence. And the political deterrence is you're sending a credible signal to Beijing that you're not going to roll over. You might eventually be occupied, but we're going to keep full conscription. We're going to spend a lot of money on getting resilient airfields. We're going to spend a lot of money in trying to immediately after an attack go into the urban areas and get stuff running again. And that's not war fighting, but it's sending a signal to Beijing that we will prevail, but we're going to set ourselves back 100 years internationally, because this is going to be an awful fight that we will eventually win. So are there different schools in the defense planning community in Taiwan that draw upon these arguments, or as you look at defense planning, are they all in the background and it's hard to develop a coherent plan? Because from their perspective, there's just so many uncertainties that are out there. And the second briefer question, with regard to the Taiwan senior military leadership, it's been some years since the KMT political officers were removed from the ranks. I've heard some reports, though, paradoxically, that the Taiwan senior military leadership is starting to get a little bit more political, and they're getting a little bit more astute at whether it's Green Party or whether it's KMT, understanding that they might develop a relationship which could one day lead to a 4-star.
Yeah, so I mean, on the first question, I think you're absolutely right that there are several different approaches that could be relevant to strengthening deterrence for Taiwan. The third one that focuses more on sort of resilience and dragging out a conflict and making it into sort of a Chinese counterinsurgency nightmare,
yes,
right? Is one that I think deserves a lot more exploration than, as far as I can tell, it's getting so far. Both in the U.S. and Taiwan, I think it's fair to say. I don't know. I'm not sure if there are really schools of thought where people you could kind of bin different strategists or different officials in one or the other. I mean, I think in a lot of my interactions with Taiwan, people have all of those in mind, and it's sort of a question of a relative emphasis sometimes. Certainly, I mean, I think there are people who really think that the symbolism of the U.S. commitment is first and foremost what they're going to really have to rely on. So let's focus on that. I think there are definitely people who would probably emphasize more that Taiwan has to be prepared to fight on its own, because while they might anticipate U.S. support, it's not guaranteed. And they would be unwise to be in a position where China could think that really by introducing a lot of putting a lot of pressure on the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, they could then have Taiwan in a very vulnerable position. So having an independent capability to respond to